All right, so, for all you future diplomats out there getting ready for the UPSC, we know international relations is pretty crucial, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And honestly, it's fascinating for everyone who doesn't want to understand how the world works.
For sure.
So we're diving deep today into one of your recommended books,
Okay.
focusing on European integration. It can be, honestly, a pretty dense topic.
Yeah.
So we're going to break it down, distill it into those key takeaways you need, the things that are, relevant for the exam and just interesting for anyone who's curious about the world.
Sounds good.
So, think about it. How did yours go from, centuries of conflict to, whatever it is today? It's
it's a big question.
It really is a big question.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to try to unpack.
I think, a lot of people, they might assume that the idea of a unified Europe kind of popped up after World War II.
Right.
But that's not really the whole story.
Yeah, the book even mentions thinkers way back, like Rousseau, St. Simon, even Mazzini, 18th, 19th centuries. They were already talking about this, European cooperation, picturing Europe as this big, political family, putting aside all their differences. It's like this European idea was already there.
It was brewing.
Yeah, it was simmering for ages.
Yeah.
But why didn't it work back then? What was, the missing ingredient?
Well, you got to imagine Europe back then. It was all these competing powers.
Yeah.
Each one was super protective of their own little territory and their own power.
Right. Yeah.
And the idea of them giving up even a tiny bit of control to some bigger entity.
Yeah.
Unthinkable. Most leaders wouldn't even consider it.
Right.
Plus, you've got nationalism just running rampant, fueled by, economic rivalries, territorial disputes. It was a recipe for division, not unity.
It's like they had all the pieces of the puzzle,
right,
but just couldn't quite figure out how to put it together.
Yeah.
But then, boom, World War II just explodes onto the scene, and suddenly everything changes, right?
Yeah.
It's like the idea of a united Europe isn't just some nice-sounding idea anymore. Yeah. It feels almost like a necessity.
Exactly, yeah. The devastation of the war, it created this urgency, a window of opportunity opened up. And the book highlights 6 major factors that really pushed European integration forward. And it's worth, really diving into those.
Okay, 6 factors. That's a lot to keep track of. So let's break it down.
All right.
First up, you've got economic reconstruction. That makes sense, right?
Absolutely.
After the war, Europe's in ruins.
Yeah.
And this idea of a larger unified market,
right,
it just seemed like the best way to get back on their feet, to really start growing again.
Yeah, think of it individual countries struggling to rebuild all on their own versus this unified force working together.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that saying, strength in number, but applied to economics.
Right. It's like a team effort. The book also talks about, finally resolving that Franco-German rivalry, which, that had been a major source of conflict.
Oh, yeah, for centuries.
For centuries. So integrating those two powerhouses, France and Germany,
right,
it just seemed like the best way to finally break that cycle of conflict.
Absolutely. And the logic was pretty straightforward. You intertwine their economies, you give them shared goals, and suddenly war becomes, a lot less appealing.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense anymore.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got these economic reasons. We've got, the need to prevent another war between France and Germany. What else was kind of pushing this European unity idea forward?
Well, there was also what they called the German problem.
Right.
After 2 world wars, everyone was kind of on edge about how to handle a powerful Germany.
Right.
So the solution, integrate them into a larger European structure.
Okay, interesting. Was that seen as a way to contain Germany, or more of a way to help them rebuild, but in a way that would benefit everyone?
I think it was a bit of both, honestly.
Okay.
Integrating Germany meant, keeping a closer eye on them,
right,
but also giving them a stake in the success of a unified Europe. It was a way to manage their power, but also create a shared future.
Right.
But you got to remember, this wasn't just about internal European dynamics. The Cold War was starting to brew.
Oh, right.
And the Soviet Union was a major concern for everyone.
Right. The U.S. and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers facing off.
Exactly.
And a united Europe, especially one aligned with the U.S., could act as a counterbalance to that Soviet influence.
Exactly. You got it. It was about security, establishing an independent role for Europe
in
a world that was increasingly divided between these two superpowers.
So we've got economic recovery, Franco-German peace, managing Germany, standing strong against the Soviet Union. I mean, that's a lot riding on this European idea.
It is.
Was there anything else fueling this push for integration?
Well, don't forget about the United States. A prosperous, united Europe was in their best interest, too.
Right.
Think about it. A strong European market for American goods, plus a united front against the spread of communism. It was a win-win for them.
It's all starting to connect now. The book also mentions this early wave of, like, idealism.
Yeah.
Almost like a dream of the United States of Europe with, like, shared sovereignty. Thinkers like Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman, they were really into that idea.
Yeah, they were big proponents of that.
But it seems like those grand federalist visions, they didn't quite pan out right.
Not at first. You know, while the ideal was there, reality was a lot more complicated.
Yeah.
Instead of this, like, sudden leap towards a federal Europe, a more practical approach kind of took hold of what they called functionalism.
Okay, so less about these grand visions and more about taking, like, concrete, achievable steps.
Exactly.
Kind of like building a house brick by brick.
Exactly. The focus shifted to economic cooperation, something that was seen as both essential and, you know, less politically sensitive.
Right.
And that's where the European coal and steel community enters the picture, the ECSC.
The ECSC always comes up. It's often cited as that first major step towards, like, real European integration.
It was a big one.
But why coal and steel? Why those two things specifically?
Well, think about it. These were the resources that fueled war machines.
Oh.
So by pooling coal and steel production under this joint management, the ECSC basically made war between France and Germany not just unthinkable, but practically impossible. It intertwined their economies in such a fundamental way, created this shared interest in peace and prosperity. It was, I mean, a brilliant move, really.
Okay, UPSC folks, take note. The ECSC, established in 1952, key milestone. But it didn't stop there.
Oh, of course not.
Yeah.
The ECSC's success basically paved the way for the European Economic Community, or EEC, in 1957.
EEC, okay.
Yeah, and the EEC, it aimed to create a common market. And as the Treaty of Rome put it, an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe.
Ever closer union. That's a pretty loaded phrase. What did that actually mean in practice? Was this the United States of Europe by another name? We'll have to find out.
I think that phrase, ever closer union, has been debated pretty much since the EEC was formed.
Right.
It's at the heart of what the EU is, or at least, you know, what it's becoming.
And the EEC did eventually become the European Union, or EU, in 1993.
Right.
But it's still kind of tricky to define, right?
Yeah.
It's not quite a country. Is it a super country? Is it just an organization?
Yeah, it's kind of a hybrid, you know, blends elements of all three. It's got those intergovernmental aspects, because that means decisions involve cooperation between member states, but it also has these, like, supranational features where EU laws and institutions, they can actually override national ones in certain areas.
Wait, hold on. So sometimes EU law actually trumps the laws of the individual countries within the EU.
Exactly.
That's a big deal.
It is, and it's this balancing act between national sovereignty and, like, EU-level decision-making that creates a lot of tension.
Right.
The book even uses these terms widening and deepening to describe two key trends within the EU.
Okay, break that down for us. What do widening and deepening actually mean?
So think of widening as, like, adding more players to the game.
Okay.
It's about expanding the EU membership. So the EU started with 6 members, and now it has 27.
Wow, yeah.
Deepening, on the other hand, that's about the game itself changing. It means transferring more power to EU institutions, giving them more say in different areas of policy.
So widening is getting bigger, and deepening is getting, well, I guess more powerful. Would that be a fair way to put it?
Exactly. And remember that Luxembourg Compromise we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
That was all about protecting national sovereignty.
Yeah.
It basically gave each member state a veto on matters they considered vital.
So back in those early days of the EEC, they were being pretty cautious about protecting the power of individual member states. But that seems to have changed over time, right?
It has. The Single European Act of 1986, that was a big turning point. So it expanded the use of qualified majority voting, which means that even the biggest countries, they can be outvoted on some issues. It's a move away from that strict consensus model of the early days.
Interesting. So the EU's gradually shifted more power towards, like, central decision-making.
Right.
But you also mentioned the supremacy of EU law. How does that work in practice?
So in areas where the EU has what they call competence, meaning it has the authority to act,
Right.
its laws actually override national laws. And this has been a major driver of integration, even if it sparks some controversy. You can kind of think of it like a hierarchy of laws, with EU law sitting at the top in those specific areas.
Okay, so there are some areas where the EU calls the shots and national laws just have to fall in line.
Right.
I can see how that could lead to a lot of debate about how much power the EU should really have.
Absolutely. And the question of whether the EU is turning into a federal entity or even a superstate is a big one.
Yeah.
It's a question that really came to a head with that attempt to introduce an EU constitution back in 2004.
Right, the EU Constitution. The book mentions that it was like this pretty ambitious attempt to create this single overarching legal framework for the EU.
Yeah, it was.
But it ultimately failed, didn't it?
It did. It was rejected in referendums in the Netherlands and France. And it signaled strong resistance to what some people saw as this move towards a European superstate. And it really highlighted the enduring importance of national identity and sovereignty for a lot of Europeans.
So even after decades of this integration, the idea of a formal EU constitution was a step too far for some.
It was.
What happened next? Did they just scrap the whole idea?
Not completely. While the Constitution itself was abandoned, a lot of its key elements were actually salvaged and incorporated into the Lisbon Treaty, which was finally ratified in 2009.
Ah, the Lisbon Treaty, another key term for our UPSC listeners out there.
Yeah.
What exactly did it change?
It was a big step towards streamlining the EU's decision-making processes and giving it a stronger voice on the global stage.
Okay.
It introduced changes to voting procedures in the Council of the European Union, expanded the powers of the European Parliament, and created the position of a permanent president of the European Council.
So not a constitution, but still a significant step towards a more integrated EU.
Definitely.
But it's for someone trying to wrap their head around all of this, it's a lot to take in.
It is. But here's the key takeaway. The EU is a unique entity. It doesn't fit neatly into any one box.
Right.
It's not a traditional state. It's not just an international organization.
Yeah.
It occupies a space somewhere in between.
So it's best to think of the EU as this work in progress, kind of like an experiment in supranational governance that's constantly evolving.
Precisely.
Okay.
It's a system with these overlapping layers of authority: national, intergovernmental, and supranational. And the balance between those layers is constantly shifting, depending on the issue at hand.
Okay, that helps explain why it's so complex. But it also makes it incredibly interesting.
Yeah.
It's like watching history unfold in real time.
Exactly. And despite all those complexities and those internal debates, the EU has achieved some pretty remarkable things. It's fostered peace and cooperation between nations that were once bitter enemies. It's created one of the largest single markets in the world, boosting prosperity for millions.
Right.
And it's given Europe a stronger voice on the world stage.
It's a great point. It's easy to get lost in the weeds of all the institutions and the treaties.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't lose sight of that bigger picture. The EU represents this, pretty audacious experiment in international cooperation.
It really does. But it's also an experiment that continues to face new challenges. You've got the UK's exit from the EU, the rise of populist movements across Europe, ongoing economic and migration crises. Those are all factors that are going to shape the future of European integration.
So while we've covered a lot about the EU's past and present, its future, still remains, kind of uncertain.
Yeah.
Almost as unpredictable as, dare I say, the UPSC exam itself.
Perhaps. But having a solid understanding of the historical context, the key institutions, and the driving forces behind European integration will definitely give you an edge when tackling those exam questions.
For sure. And for those of you who are tuning in just because you're curious and want to learn something new, we hope this deep dive has given you a better appreciation for just how fascinating and complex the world of European integration really is. It's a story that's as much about the future of global governance as it is about the past and present of Europe.
It is. We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From those early visions of a unified Europe to the complex workings of the EU as it stands today.
Yeah.
But before we wrap things up, let's take a step back and think about what it all means. What does the story of European integration tell us about how the very idea of sovereignty is changing in our globalized world?
It's a really interesting question. We usually think of countries as being like totally independent, right? Calling all their own shots.
Right.
But the EU kind of challenges that whole idea.
It does. The EU experience suggests that sovereignty, it isn't this like absolute all or nothing concept anymore.
Right.
In a world that's so interconnected,
Yeah.
countries are finding that sometimes it makes sense to share decision-making power, to achieve those common goals.
It's almost like they're saying, hey, we can accomplish more together than we can on our own.
Exactly.
And in the EU, that's played out in, like, trade, monetary policy, even justice and home affairs.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty significant stuff.
It is. Member states have willingly given up some aspects of their national sovereignty in those areas because they see the benefits of acting together. It's a fascinating example of how those global challenges, they're pushing us to rethink those traditional ideas of statehood and sovereignty.
So does this mean we might see more regional blocs like the EU popping up in other parts of the world?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe like global institutions like the UN taking on a bigger role?
Those are the kinds of questions that policymakers, scholars, and yes, even UPSC aspirants are grappling with today.
Right.
The future of global governance, it's very much up in the air. It's a dynamic process, just like the story of European integration.
Okay, so to wrap things up, let's bring it back to our UPSC aspirants out there. We've covered a lot, but what are the absolute must-know takeaways from all this?
All right, so first, remember that European integration, it's a journey, not a destination. It's been shaped by this mix of historical events, economic forces, political ideas, and it's still evolving today. Don't treat it like some static set of facts to memorize. Try to understand that, the how and the why behind it all.
Makes sense. You need to know more than just the what. You need to know the why.
Exactly.
Especially for the UPSC.
Especially for the UPSC. Second, make sure you really understand those key EU institutions we talked about.
Right.
The European Commission, the Council of the European Union, the European Parliament, the European Court of Justice.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing how they work and how they interact, that's crucial for understanding the EU as a whole.
Those institutions are like the gears that make the whole EU machine run, right?
That's a good way to think about it. And finally, pay attention to those ongoing debates about the EU's future.
Okay.
We talked about that tension between federalization and national sovereignty, those challenges posed by economic crises and migration, the impact of Brexit. These are all shaping the EU's direction.
It's a reminder that this story is far from over.
It's not.
The EU is constantly navigating these internal tensions while also trying to find its place, on the world stage.
Exactly.
And for those of you who joined us just out of curiosity, we hope this deep dive has given you a taste of how fascinating and complex the world of European integration really is.
Absolutely.
We know we've covered a lot of information, but consider this your starting point. We encourage you to, dig deeper, look into those specific treaties, institutions, and events we mentioned.
For sure.
There's always more to learn.
Always.
As you continue exploring, here's a final thought to chew on. What are the potential benefits and challenges of further European integration? Think about it not just for Europe, but like for the whole world.
It's a question with no easy answers.
Right.
But it's at the heart of understanding the EU's role in the 21st century. And who knows, maybe some of you listening will be the ones shaping that future.
That's a great point.
Until then, keep those brains buzzing, future diplomats and engaged citizens. The world needs your curiosity and your insights.
And that's a wrap on our deep dive into European integration. If you found this episode helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a topic that matters. Until then, keep learning and stay curious.